All right, we're going to look at advantages and disadvantages of the Electoral College and some of the problems people have and some of the potential solutions to that. But first, let's take just a few minutes and look at some different ways to visualize the presidential election, because we're used to a pretty normal electoral map, and it does not always give us the best picture of what actually took place in the election. Now, what you see here is the typical Electoral College map. This is a map of the United States with each state colored to represent which candidate that state voted for. So we see all the states there. You see a lot of blue. You see a lot of red. Now, when I look at this map, I see an overwhelming amount of red, which would lead me to believe that Donald Trump has more support for president. But in fact, we know the outcome of this election was that Donald Trump did not win a majority of the electoral votes, and he lost the popular vote by a few million votes. And so even though this map kind of distorts the outcome of the election, it makes it look as if Donald Trump had a ton of support across the country here. This is maybe not the best way to look at this, and this is one of the criticisms of using the Electoral College, is it kind of distorts our view of the outcome of the election. So we're going to look at just a few other ways to visualize this same information. All right, here's another way we can look at this same information. So this is a representation of the Electoral College, and you see they've tried to loosely represent the shape of the various states here. What they've done in this picture is they have made each square here represents one electoral vote. And they've made the shape of the state out of how many electoral votes each of those states have. You see very small states like North Dakota has 3 squares to represent its 3 electoral votes. You see California being very, very, very large over there with its 55 electoral votes. So this is a better visual representation of the outcome of the election, because what I see here is I do not see an overwhelming amount of red. What I see is way more blue than red, which is more indicative of the outcome of the election. So based on the 2020 election here, there are 306 squares for Joe Biden compared to the 230 squares for President Trump. Now, this map does not tell us as much about the Electoral College, but this shows us a much better representation of the votes in the United States. So what we have here is there is a circle for each county in the United States. And the circles are bigger or smaller depending on how many people live in that county. So the counties that were won by Democrat are blue. The counties that are won by the Republican, Donald Trump, are red. And you see here that President Trump absolutely won more counties across the country, but that Biden was able to win the larger counties in most circumstances all across the country. The biggest circles you see are blue circles. So this helps us learn a little bit about where the support for these candidates is. And this shows us, that if you look in that area up there, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, you see that there's, those are only tiny dots up there. So they take up a lot of space on our original electoral map, but they don't translate into a lot of votes. So this helps us better understand where the voters are and where the voter support is coming from. This final representation here, this is a map that shows the margin of victory across the country. So this is very similar to the last map, but this is showing us the gaps between Democrats and Republicans. So again, there's a dot for every county, and you'll see that there are way more red dots than blue dots. But some of those blue dots are very large, indicating that in the cities, there are large gaps where there are way more Democrats than Republicans in most of the cities across the United States. And in the rural areas, there are smaller gaps between the number of Republicans and Democrats there. So we can get a good picture of how the voters, like where the voter support is across the country. We can see areas where there's a lot of support for Democrats, and we can see areas where there's a lot of support for Republicans. But this is a better way to take a look at where the voter support is. Again, this map doesn't tell us a whole lot about the Electoral College, but this map does help us understand the outcome of the election a little better than the initial Electoral College map. All right, so we're going to move on now and talk about criticism of the Electoral College and look at some potential reforms for the Electoral College. We've had a lot of fuss about the Electoral College over the last few election cycles here, because recently we've had two people win a majority of the electoral votes while losing the popular vote across the country. And so this is causing more and more anger from American voters who want the candidate with the most votes to become the president. Before we focus on complaints about the Electoral College, let's take just a second to look at some of the good features of using the Electoral College. So this will help us understand why we use the Electoral College here. First of all, the Electoral College helps to ensure that the election is not decided by only the biggest cities in the country. We can get to a point where the majority of Americans live in just a handful of the biggest cities across the country, and this makes sure that the elections are not just decided by, New York, LA, DC, Houston, those cities spread across the country. The Electoral College makes each state important in its own way, and so this makes the candidates kind of travel to different parts of the country and deal with 50 different battlegrounds across the country here. The Electoral College also emphasizes the importance of federalism. Our government is not just a national government, but our government is a relationship between a national government and 50 different state governments. And so this emphasizes federalism because it's the states that handle the election of the federal officials. And this makes each state important in the election of our most important federal official, the president. So this does make each state important in its own way. A lot of states we do know ahead of time here, but the states that become important in each election, they change over time. So sometimes the important states may be Ohio and Florida, but other times those states may shift, and they may be states like Arizona and Colorado. And so this makes states important. The candidates can't take any states for granted. We'll see candidates often fighting over a place like New Hampshire, even though it's very small. It's only got 3 votes. But this gives each state an important role in the presidential election. The Electoral College also encourages stability. And so it encourages stability, and it encourages the stability that comes with the two-party system here. The Democrat and the Republican are going to be the main candidates in every election. The Electoral College kind of ensures that all this infrastructure is in place to keep things that way. So what you want is a stable, predictable government, then the Electoral College helps us ensure that stays in place. We don't really worry about candidates coming out of nowhere, getting the most votes and becoming president and doing crazy things or whatever. So this helps encourage stability and keeps things pretty normal for us here. And the final thing about the Electoral College that's important is it isolates the impact of any election fraud. We talked earlier about how we could have a state's electoral votes thrown out if there's election fraud taking place. And this is one of the good features of the Electoral College. So if there were a problem, and there were a problem with the election in one of the states, then we just take those states' votes out of the electoral count, and the election is still fine. Right? We have 50 different states voting here. So this helps us isolate any problem with fraud. If we just had one big national vote and there was some type of electoral fraud there, it could impact the whole election. But here we can isolate it to one state, and we can remove that state's impact on the election. All right, well, let's get into the criticism of the Electoral College. Main criticism is that this is not an accurate reflection of the vote. In rare cases, but less rare recently, the winner of the popular vote, that means the candidate who gets the most votes nationally, does not always win the Electoral College. In the case of George W. Bush in 2000, and in the case of Donald Trump in 2016, both of those candidates got less votes nationally than their opponent. Yet those candidates got a majority of the electoral votes because of the combination of states that they won, and so they became president. Now, this is super rare, but it has happened 2 times in the last 20 years. So the Electoral College is getting a lot of criticism for this reason, because this means that the person with less votes may end up becoming president. Another problem here, we do a lot of polling. We poll states all the time. We always try to poll voters and find out how they feel about the election. And with modern polling, we can predict the outcome of most states ahead of time. And this way, we know that like California is going to go to the Democrat. Tennessee is going to go to the Republican. We know that Montana is going to go to the Republican. We know that Illinois is going to go to the Democrat. We know so many of these states ahead of time that they become unimportant in the outcome of the election. They get left out. The candidates don't end up going there. We end up with, in each election, we end up with a handful of what we call battleground states or swing states. These are states where we're not sure of the outcome of the election, and these states get all of the focus in the election. And so which states are the swing states may change from election to election, but there's really only a handful of states in each election that are going to get a lot of attention from the candidate. One of the big criticisms of the Electoral College is that it is going to overemphasize the votes of small states and it is going to diminish the votes of large states. So it's going to help smaller states and it's going to hurt larger states. And we're going to do a little math to prove that. Part of this is due to the fact that in general, there is one representative for every 750,000 people in the country. But state populations don't work out nice and even for us. There are some states whose population is smaller than 750,000 and they still get a representative. There's some states who don't have quite enough to get two, but they have two distributed anyway because we don't have states share representative. In electoral votes, let's look at it this way. The United States population is about 325 million. This is based on our most recent census. We'll have to update these numbers after the 2020 census is complete. There are 538 electoral votes. Now, California, the state, has a population of 39.3 million people. That means that California has 12.2% of the United States population. California has more electoral votes than any other state. They have 55 electoral votes, but that's only 10.2% of the electoral votes. So you see that they have 12% of the population, but only 10% of the votes. As the biggest state, California's votes are hurt by the Electoral College. Wyoming, on the other hand, our smallest state, they have 585,000 people. So that means they have 0.18% of the United States population. But because the smallest number of votes anyone can have is 3, Wyoming has 3 votes, which means that they have 0.6% of the electoral votes. Not a lot, but that means the votes of Wyoming are overemphasized and the votes of California are underemphasized. Even Tennessee, which is a slightly larger state, Tennessee has 6.7 million people, so that's 2.1% of the United States population. Our 11 electoral votes only end up being 2% of the electoral votes. So Tennessee is one of those states that is underemphasized by the Electoral College. So one of the big problems here is that the Electoral College is going to make smaller states more important than they should be, and it's going to make bigger states less important than they should be. Here's another problem with the Electoral College is we mentioned the battleground states, the swing states. Now, these are the states that the candidates will spend a lot of time in, and candidates will basically ignore the states where we already know the outcome. This map comes from the 2004 election. It's an older election, but the purple spots where you see a purple hand, that represents a candidate visiting the state. If you see a green dollar sign, that represents a candidate spending $1 million in that state. And if you look at these maps here, this represents visits and money spent on advertising and campaigning and all that. You'll see that the majority of the states in the country get ignored, right? You'll see that in the case of this election, there were tons and tons. There were nonstop visits to Ohio and Florida, to Wisconsin and Iowa and Pennsylvania. You'll see that so much money was spent in Florida and Pennsylvania and Ohio. Now, I'm a Tennessean. I sure would like to be involved in the presidential election, and there was not one visit from a candidate, and there was not a lot of money spent here. So most of the states end up ignored because of the Electoral College. So how can we change this? The most important thing to know about changing the Electoral College is that it is unlikely. In order to change the Electoral College, since the Electoral College is found in Article 2 and it is adjusted in the 12th Amendment, the only way to get rid of the Electoral College is to add a constitutional amendment. So we'd have to add an amendment to the Constitution. You guys remember the process for adding an amendment to the Constitution. It's most likely going to take 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and it's going to take ratification of 3/4 of the states. So 3/4 of all the states are going to have to agree to this amendment if we're going to get rid of the Electoral College. But we just learned that small states are more important in the election than they should be because of the Electoral College. So small states are not going to ratify an amendment that makes them less important in the presidential election. Battleground states, some of those swing states, the Ohio, the Florida, those kind of states who get a lot of attention in the presidential election, they don't want to give that attention up. You saw the millions of dollars spent in those states. So battleground states would not ratify this amendment either. Any state that had been a battleground state recently would not ratify this amendment. So this amendment is never going to get ratified. This amendment's probably not going to get proposed in the first place. Remember, it has to be proposed by 2/3 of all of the members of the House and the Senate. And one of the things we said earlier, one of the advantages here is this helps protect the stability, because it helps it make it so that it's more likely that one of the major party candidates is going to win. So in order to even get this amendment proposed, it would require 2/3 of votes from Democrats and Republicans, even though Democrats and Republicans are the main groups that benefit from the Electoral College. So adding an amendment to the Constitution to change the Electoral College is unlikely, but there are other alternatives. One of the features of the plan we mentioned earlier is that the states can choose to give away their electoral votes however they see fit. So it's up to the states to decide how to do this. One of the plans mentioned that could replace the Electoral College is what's called the Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So far, 15 states have agreed to this plan, and what they would do here is they would promise to give their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. Now, the details of this pledge to each other is that the details of this compact are that they would not actually give their votes out that way until enough states had joined the Interstate Compact to add up to 270 electoral votes. So this is totally legal, and this could change the Electoral College without an amendment because the states themselves get to decide how they're going to give out their electoral votes. If enough states agreed that they would end up with a number of electoral votes that was more than 270, then this could effectively change the Electoral College into a popular vote election. Now, this is an interstate compact, so if we go back to Article 4, this would be up to Congress to enforce. So if the states promise this to each other and one state decided to break the compact, it's not really sure how this would work out. It would be up to Congress to enforce this. But then the Popular Vote Interstate Compact would be the only one of these reforms that we're going to look at today that would be more advantageous to Democratic candidates. These other plans we're going to look at are different ways to distribute the votes, and they might be more advantageous to Republican candidates. So another one of these plans is already in use by 2 states. This is called the district plan. Now remember, states can decide to give their electoral votes however they decide to give them away. So the states themselves can come up with whatever plan they want to give away their electoral votes. So this is the plan that Maine and Nebraska already use, but they don't always end up splitting their votes here in the election. Maine and Nebraska use a system where each congressional district is worth 1 electoral vote. The candidate in the state that wins the most districts gets the 2 extra votes. And so this allows the votes to be distributed a little more like the votes of the state. So what happened in the 2020 election is Nebraska gave 1 electoral vote to Joe Biden and gave the rest of its electoral votes to Trump. Maine gave 1 electoral vote to Trump and the rest of its electoral votes to Biden, because each place has 1 congressional district where the opposition party had the most votes there. The problem with this plan is that this plan, like the House of Representatives, would be subject to gerrymandering. So this plan currently would be advantageous to Republican candidates, and we'll look at the map and see how this plan would have impacted the 2016 election. Here you see the results of the election in 2016. President Trump won with 306 electoral votes. You see all of those states there gave away their electoral votes in the way that you can see. You can see Maine is striped because Maine already uses the district plan here. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a map that would show us if the votes were counted according to the district plan in all 50 states, what the results would look like. So keep in mind the 306 for Trump and the 232 for Clinton here. This is using the current winner-take-all system. And here we see the results of the 2016 election map if every state had used the district method. So you would see some of those states like California would end up giving 7 votes to Republicans. Texas would end up giving 14 votes to Democrats. Florida would be split 16 and 13. You can see in Tennessee, the Memphis district and the Nashville district would both go for a vote toward the Democrats. So we have a much closer election here. We'd have Clinton with 248 votes to Trump's 290 votes. So this election would be a more close reflection the outcome of the votes in this election, but this was an election where Hillary Clinton got more votes than Donald Trump. So this would still be a system that would overall benefit the Republican Party with the structure of this election, because the Republican Party, you see, they rarely give up seats in these smaller states. So in the states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Montana, they're not giving up any votes, but they're gaining large numbers of seats in big states like New York, Illinois, California. So this is one way to change the way we do the Electoral College, but it wouldn't necessarily solve the problems of the Electoral College. Another plan that people suggest is what's called the proportional plan, where each state would give its electoral votes at the same proportion of their state election results. So if, for example, if Donald Trump won 60% of the votes and Hillary Clinton won 40% of the votes, then Donald Trump should get 60% of the electoral votes and Hillary Clinton should get 40% of the electoral votes. Most states in this situation would end up with a pretty close split, because states are not like all Democrat or all Republican, but most states are a pretty good mix, and so most states would end up pretty close to split here. Now, this is another plan. This would give advantages to Republican candidates, because Republican candidates would continue to win the small states, and the Democratic candidates would lose their advantage in the big states. So we'll look at this on the map as well and see how this plan would shake out. So once again, here's our map of the 2016 election. We have Trump with 306 electoral votes to Clinton's 232. This is showing all of our states using the winner-take-all method, except for Nebraska and Maine using the district method. You can see Maine split up there in the top right. Nebraska did not split in this particular election. So this is 306 to Trump to 232 to Clinton. Let's see what these states would look like if we use proportional representation. All right, in this case, we have a very interesting election outcome because what we've done here, if we split the votes proportionally, it now becomes possible for third-party candidates to get some of the votes. If you see a green square on this map, it means that at least one of the electoral votes went to a third-party candidate. Up at the top, Clinton got 265 votes using the proportional method. Trump got 267, and the third party got 6 votes. Now, here's the problem. Trump's vote total, even though it's more than Clinton's, it is not 270. So in this case, this election, no candidate would get a majority of the electoral votes. This election would have resulted in the House of Representatives deciding who the president is. But you can see here that if you look at the small states, this is why this plan would help Republicans. In the small states, what they're doing, what's happening is they're typically giving away 1 vote to Democrats. And then in the larger states where the Democrats have been successful, you see California, they're giving up 21 votes. In New York, they're giving up 12 votes. In Illinois, they're giving up 8 votes. So the Democrats give up way more votes in the big states than the Republicans do cumulatively in the small states. And so this is one of the reasons this plan would structurally benefit Republican candidates. All right, that's it for the Electoral College. So we've done a lot today. We figured out how the Electoral College works. We've looked at some of the problems and some of the potential reforms here. Here we have our friend President Trump with a couple of President Trump's thoughts about the Electoral College. Sometimes he hates it, sometimes he loves it, but let's make sure that we know all the things that we need to do for today. First thing you need to do here, we need to be able to understand how the Electoral College is a check on the voters, right? We need to know this initial design of the Electoral College, how this was a check on the voters here. We need to be able to describe the features of the Electoral College. You need to be able to describe the winner-take-all system and its impact on campaigns. We talked about it briefly. You need to be able to describe the advantages of using the Electoral College. This is the kind of thing that might come up in like an argument essay. So you need to be able to come up with at least one advantage of using the Electoral College, even if you disagree with it. And then you need to be able to describe the criticisms of the Electoral College and the potential reforms. Also really important that we would remember the roles of the House and Senate in the Electoral College if we were unable to get a majority of votes. All right, that's it for the Electoral College. We've gone through one more process dealing with the president. We're going to start to shift over the next couple days to look at the president's staff as we kind of move from the president themselves into more of the role of the federal bureaucracy. So we'll be looking at the White House staff and those aides that are closest to the president of the United States, help the president do their job as we move into the role of the bureaucracy.